Okay, so I guess I do this now. I say things before the podcast gets started. But so Brandon, Richard, and I, we've been talking about how we're going to close out, how we're going to end out this podcast series we've been doing. And one of the things we've talked about is having a live recording at the museum here in town, the Museum of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And so we've been able to get permission, and we're going to be there September 8th. If you are going to be in town, say you're somebody who's local to the area of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, or just plan on being in this part of the world on September 8th, we invite you to come out and meet us there at the Museums of Hopkinsville, where we're going to be recording live and discussing even some more the ideas that we've talked about in this book, the concepts, the struggles, the history, all of that. So you're invited to come out and be a part of the live studio audience, as it were, on September 8th, and more details to come. But thank you guys for your prayers, your support, for everything you've done right now, just being along on the journey with us. All right, thanks. Here's today's episode.
Mike D.
I pushed the button.
We already got one of those.
Push the button.
There you go.
We are. What are we this time?
Live.
Push it.
You sure we're live this time?
We're live.
Episode
Okay.
number 8.
No, it's not.
Nine,
It's
10.
9.
It's nine.
Something.
I said I'm going to do this, and I don't do this.
You said this every episode.
I do. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm having adjusted. We talked about mic discipline. There we go.
Discipline.
You feel better now?
I feel better now.
feel better.
All right, so we are going to try and close out chapter 4.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, let's do this. We need to pray first, and then I'm going to have Richard take the lead because
this is my favorite.
Because it's his favorite subject.
I have a book on it, so I'm an expert too.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what. I'll pray, and then
Yeah.
Richard, I want you
Okay.
to jump us off on where you want to go on this.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
All right, God, thank you for this fellowship, this brotherhood. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your Son, who enables us to learn and forgive and grow. God, I pray you will cover this time with your Spirit, that we may actually engage in a meaningful way that glorifies you, that brings unity and healing to the world, because that is part of why you died. You died to forgive us of our sins and heal us, but also to heal this world, God. So help us to do the gospel work right now of bringing healing to this community, to this world, as we discuss these hard things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
So guys, at the end of one of the last episodes, I remember, I think, Kamarr, you said something I said that might have sounded a little bit crazy, but lynching did so much for our country. And I wanted to talk about that because I don't know, I have a fascination behind lynching. We were actually looking into going to the National Lynching Museum to discuss and to see what happened. And there's a recent book that I've picked up not too long ago. It's called Red Summer by a guy named Cameron McWhirter. And it
Show
discusses...
it to the camera, too, because
we got a
there are some
camera
people who are
thing.
watching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a great book. The idea is that at the turn of the century, there was a lot of things going on. I mean, this is after the Civil War. This is when the Black Codes, the predecessor to Jim Crow, started to come in. The war was upon us. The Great World War I was there. I mean, if you guys remember, I think it was 1918 was the Spanish flu that killed so many people. And then 1919 comes. The soldiers are returning from war. For one of the first times ever, you've got large numbers of African Americans going overseas. They're being put in war situations along beside their white counterparts. They're going to countries. They're feeling like real men for the very first time. I mean, they're going into places like Germany and different places, and they're being treated like men, like soldiers, like heroes, like warriors. And they get a taste of this freedom, and then they come home. So in 1919, very interesting things begin to happen. This is known as Bloody Summer, but it lasted more than just the summer. 1919 sparked a change in the way we see history. I mean, we see that slavery was bad. We see that the Black Codes were bad, but we are starting to see the birth of a very, very violent hatred between the races.
Yeah.
And what we're looking at in 1919 is the year when lynching literally changed the course of history in the United States of America. Literally, we had, and we'll get locally to Hopkinsville in just a second, but I just want to run down some of the cities that had lynchings. Some of these are massive lynchings, like there's multiple people. Some are singular, maybe just one person. But Charleston, South Carolina, there's Ellisville, Cleveland, Longview, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Austin, Texas, Knoxville, Tennessee, which my wife is from Knoxville, Tennessee. And she grew up there, went to school there, went to high school there. She never knew there was a lynching in downtown Knoxville, Tennessee. And it was a big lynching. She never heard about it. She was never taught about it. And yet when she's, as a full-grown adult woman, she learns about these things. Omaha, Nebraska. One of the things that it talks about, it doesn't get its own chapter because it technically wasn't a lynching, but what happened in Corbin, Kentucky. In Corbin, Kentucky, literally every African-American male, female, and child was literally ran out of town, put on a rail car, and sent to Knoxville because of white hatred. Yeah. Now, we're going to talk about actual lynchings that took place right here in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And we do that because we need to know our history, but also in the fact that there was a growing hatred. There was something called the new Klan that was about to emerge. We didn't get into this really last time, but the Ku Klux Klan really started at the tail end of the Civil War, or actually right after the Civil War. We know that Nathan Bedford Forrest did not start it, but he was considered the first grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, which slightly had a different take. Although they did some violent things, they were not known for being aggressively terroristic as they became later on. So there was another iteration of the Klan that started right around this time. And it's important to us because if you Google where are white supremacist groups in the country, you will get a map dotted all over the country. And as you begin to zoom in to where we're located in Western Kentucky, matter of fact, if you zoom in to Hopkinsville, you'll see directly north at a little town that got hit by a tornado not too long ago called Dawson Springs. And there is a certified official Ku Klux Klan chapter that is right there. And this is a part of the Klan that historically has been known to terrorize people of color, to terrorize and to kill, and to scare, to put fear into. That organization still exist as we, as pastors, discuss the multi-ethnic possibilities, racial reconciliation in the community that we live in. We see something just to the north of us that would want to stop all that. Yeah. So as we get in this conversation about lynching, it's important. And I say, and we can get into this, but I say it was so important. And that lynching, and this sounds horrible, was one of the best things that could have happened. Because in 1919, we see something interesting. There was a group called the NAACP. Yeah. We talked a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois last year, or last episode.
I talked about him last year too.
Yeah, we did. We always talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. But the one thing about him is he actually said that. He said that lynching was actually a good thing because it brought so much awareness to the cause of black people around the country that otherwise people never would have known how bad people were treated.
That was Ida B. Wells, right?
She said it too.
She was the reporter.
She was a reporter, yeah. And because it began to get in newspapers, it began to be written about. It started to get legs as far as stories that were told about. Where the lynchers, the terrorizers, they thought they were trying to quell local, what they called agitators or people that would do bad things. What was actually happening was the atrocities. I mean, when we talk about lynching, we're talking about not just people getting killed, but people being hung from trees, people being burned from trees, people's body parts being dismembered. Yeah. We're talking about beheadings. We're talking about being thrown off of bridges. We're talking about some super gross things that normal people just don't normally think about until a mob mentality with blood in their eyes begins to cry out for what they would call justice. But there is no justice with a mob. It's only whatever the mob rules.
There's a documentary that came out in 2021 I showed it to some of my students. I'm still in the school, called Lynching Postcards. I encourage you to look it up and go and watch it if you haven't seen it.
It's great.
And I showed it to them because in that documentary, they mention Hopkinsville.
Yes.
And I said, this is why it's relevant, because people are going to think of us. And in them, they just mentioned how they bought the postcard while they were in Hopkinsville. This is what they think in Hoptown. But this is part of the phenomena of just postcards to commemorate these lynchings. And it's a graphic documentary as it talks about it. But I encourage you, if you are able to watch and want to learn, it is a great resource, and something they mentioned in that documentary that it now no longer is true. But how Du Bois and Wells and other people in NAACP, they went to Congress and said, we need a national law to make this illegal.
Yes.
And it wasn't until 2022 that it finally became illegal in this country
That's right.
to lynch someone.
So it became a federal crime.
Yeah. Yes.
Now think about that.
I was going to say, it was illegal. It was illegal, but it was not a federal offense.
It was not a federal offense. It was murder is always illegal.
Yes.
But here's the thing. Lynching is different than murder.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And because of the systems that were created in the South, for example, if a lynching took place in 1940, or we're talking about 1919, you're going to have a jury of your peers that will be all white. And they're going to go in a courtroom and they're going to look at a white man who is accused of killing an African American. Most of those cases are over within an hour.
Yeah.
And they said, no, there
Self-defense, cultural good. It was,
Yeah.
they weren't actually, lynching essentially was actually a legal thing to do because it was deemed as one of these socially acceptable measures to take to defend society.
And one of the things that you see in that documentary that you mentioned, these postcards had pictures of literally sometimes 100 people in the picture, watching, posing, smiling.
Little girls,
little children, men and women. Lynching was it wasn't televised. It was broadcasted over the newspaper. They would tell you when a lynching would happen. So imagine this for a second. The newspaper, the Saturday evening newspaper, puts out, tomorrow afternoon, we're going to lynch us a Negro. It's telling you that this crime is about to happen. The fact that it's lynching means that it wasn't litigated. It wasn't adjudicated. It didn't go to court. There was no jury. There was no conviction. It was just fear. And the majority of times when we see the Red Summer, it was because there was an accusation, and we'll see this even in Hopkinsville. There was an accusation of an African American that had touched a white woman, or presumably or allegedly tried to have a relationship with a white woman, and that angered the white population to the point of, we need to put a message out there that this is not accepted or tolerated. So let's get some good old boys together and go and do what we do.
Yeah. Brandon, before we get even deeper into, because we're going to talk about so many things. Because I will never know what it feels like to be a white guy. I won't.
And conversely, I will never know what it feels like to be a black man.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
why we have conversations, so that we can learn.
But I want to know, what does the word, the topic, this idea, what does it feel like for you when we talk about lynching, this idea? Because we have, and we're different because I grew up in California, grew up in Tennessee, you grew up in the South, so there's different, yes. But still, I would say that even though Richard and I have different ideas, our idea might be a lot more in common than what your idea might be. I don't know. What do you think of? What does this idea of lynching even bring to mind for you?
Well, I think about the tragedy of it, right? This is a travesty, and if we can't agree that this is wrong, and if it's not until 2022 that it's illegal, we should kind of rethink some things. That's what I approach it as. I don't have as much of the visceral reaction of that could have been me, because it probably couldn't have been me. But I do have that sense of, this is horrible. And I do go back to an earlier discussion about power, and how this is that attempt to take what power had been given by the law before and to reinstate that, or to reestablish that power now outside of the law. Yeah. And that was my point earlier. Lynching was always illegal, right? Murder was always illegal. Yeah. But it was the state's recognition of this as...
And I have a slight pushback. I think the idea of lynching should be illegal, But I think we would have to dig the internet pretty severely to find a case of where someone was convicted of lynching back when we're talking.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. It doesn't make it right.
So if it wasn't,
it was always immoral. It was always immoral.
That's
but
what
it
I'm
wasn't
trying to
always
get at.
illegal.
Yeah,
That's what I'm trying to say.
I think that's what your pushback because
Exactly.
because for Brandon, your heart is this is wrong. It must be illegal. Sorry, Brandon, but that's not how America works.
Well, no. I get that, but that's what I'm pushing back on is just because the U.S. says this is illegal doesn't mean it was ever okay.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I'm just like, I don't understand. I can't put myself in the mindset of somebody that says, I'm going to the lynching. Yay.
Yeah, and that's what I was about to say. It wasn't immoral for white Southerners.
No.
I'm sure there were some that were completely, terrified or mortified by the idea. But when you see these postcards, when you see hundreds of people, men, women, and children showing up, eating picnic baskets of food, it was a picnic. And think of the optics. They were under the assumption that this person that's being lynched got caught, did something so wrong that we've got to show them who's in control.
Yeah.
I think that's the key there is that it's that exercise of power. And I've talked about before in the West, growing up where I did, the whole idea of vigilante justice.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's a key part of the story of the part of the country where I came from.
Yeah.
Right.
And now I look back at that and I say, some of the heroes of the West were wrong in how they carried out that justice.
Yeah. They were deputized murderers.
Deputized, absolutely. And I think that ability to say whether it's motivated for whatever its motivation, it's still wrong to go outside of the law in this instance, in this way, right? It's wrong no matter if that's a white guy or a black guy up there. I think the power dynamic in lynching is what makes it different from what I saw in the history of where I grew up.
Yeah.
Because it was this insistence of the law may have moved beyond this, but we know better.
Right.
And we're going to establish our dominance. And so my reaction is, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's terrible. How in the world did anybody, especially anybody in a place where Christianity was supposedly the reigning worldview,
Christian County.
Yeah.
how did that gain cultural acceptance? I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't wrap my head around it.
Were you wanting, Richard, for us to look at on 143? Because we're talking about how and newspaper bits. That's one I know that where they say specifically about
Let's talk about yeah. We're talking about Benjamin. This is on page 142. Benjamin Brame.
Yeah.
This is a young man, and let's just take a look at him for a second. This was. I'm not exactly familiar. I think this is on the south, maybe western part of the county, but it's called Flat Lick. Have you heard of that location?
I've heard of it. I've not been there.
Brandon, do you know where Flat Lick is?
I don't, sadly.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I know it's south. You are correct. It is south,
Okay.
but I don't know specifically where in Southern Christian County it is.
Yeah. I mean,
Somebody who's listening could tell us, I'm sure.
Yeah.
yeah. And it says today it's a modern, it's got population growth, but it says Flat Lick has a familiar, prosaic quality that belies the outburst of a vengeful killing that took the life of a terrified youth a century ago. That youth, Benjamin Brame, was also known as Booker. Adds a particular tragic irony to his murder. Some 50 years before, Flat Lake lay on a supposed route of the slaves of Stewart County, Tennessee, believed to be bent on fighting their way to Hopkinsville en route to freedom. So essentially it sounds like the Underground Railroad, which is a recent discovery, it sounds like, that's taken place here. And so the idea is that this young man, he was accused of touching two little white girls. And it sounds like the little girls got away. They were left unharmed. It says, alleged on April the 8th to have grabbed Ruth Gee as she and her young sister Sally were in the rural yard. Brame was reported to have fled after the younger girl fought him off with a hatchet, which the whole story, I mean, of course, we can't go back in history, but you got to...
It may be true, may not be true.
May have been.
Because there was no trial, we don't really know.
And the reality is, if he did it,
If he did it.
Did he? Is that did it?
If he did do it.
If he did do it, yeah, there you go. Did it? If he did do it, it still doesn't justify a lynching.
Yeah.
And that's we are a nation of laws.
Allegedly.
Well, whether we like those laws or whether we don't, we are as Kamarr says, allegedly we are a nation of laws. We do have laws on the books.
Right.
And so to work outside of the law is never permissible.
Well, I mean, I say allegedly. I mean, we're gonna derail a little bit, and we're gonna get back to this. I'm not gonna change the page.
You're all right.
But we were talking a little bit before we started recording. We look at some of the things that have happened in culture in America in these last couple of weeks, especially, and this back and forth. Again, you talk about vigilante justice. Even like you guys weren't there. I was jokingly, talking about like, hey, if I'm getting beat up, you're gonna come. And Brandon's like, no, sorry. I'm like, you won't punch somebody? No. Like, but the idea is that this is so embedded in American culture, even still, that this idea, we have laws in place, but if you cross a line, I'm going to assert X, Y, and Z things to defend myself, my family, my honor, my whatever. You stepped on my shoes, or you parked in my parking spot. I mean, it happens on both sides, or all sides rather, ethnically. It's not like it's one culture over another.
That's right.
And so I say allegedly because we have these laws, yes, but there's also this unwritten American law, like you said, the Western idea that says, but at the same time, though, if you mess with me and mine, forget laws.
Yeah.
I mean, so
that's true. That's true. And I think even in the South, we have kind of that John Wayne mentality. That's kind of, we kind of stick together and we kind of, don't mess with my, don't step on my property, don't touch my stuff, things like that. In the South, you don't scratch another man's truck. There's certain things you just don't do.
Good thing I don't drive a truck.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right.
There's certain things you just don't do.
It's black or white.
Yeah.
And that's black or white. There is.
Yeah.
There's an American pride, but then there's a Southern pride.
Yeah.
Right.
We proud. I mean, I guess I'm the only true Southerner that's
because we're
here.
Westerners.
Yeah. But in the South, we love being from the South. We love sweet tea, fried chicken. We love all that kind
I like
of
those
stuff.
things. Yeah,
like
sweet
that?
tea, fried chicken.
But that's our stuff, right? We invented that
But
stuff.
Kamarr is going to culturally appropriate that stuff.
Right? Well, it's already been.
I am the great gentrifier. There you go. here to culturally appropriate all your things.
You don't have to decolonize it, right?
Yeah. But so it's amazing to me, and we've talked before about Glazier's approach and his obvious agenda in writing.
Yeah.
It's there. It's absolutely there. But this is a masterful paragraph at the top of page 143.
Yeah.
Like this is well done. This is excellent writing because he ends with, and he doesn't call attention to it. It's subtle, and it's just the kind of thing I love. Where he says, then attempting to shoot Brame, the girl's father was reportedly restrained by the posse just in time, he's quoting, to prevent him taking vengeance into his own hands. As if what the crowd is doing is not taking vengeance, and what this father tried to do was take vengeance. It's like, no, you are taking vengeance, crowd, lynching bee, even if the work is quickly done and quietly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what it's doing is it's legitimizing the lynching as if it in itself is justice.
This is justice, but if the father shoots him, that's vengeance.
Then it's revenge.
Yeah.
And revenge is bad.
Well, two things from that paragraph in the beginning of the next one, I think are important for helping some people understand things that are confusing. So when the Black Lives Matter movement exploded on the scene, as it were, when it was still focused exclusively on black issues, because now it's expanded, I get that. A lot of people I encountered, especially white people, were coming to me and say, I don't understand why everybody's so up in arms. I don't understand how this is considered some racist thing that happened with the police. And there's two sections of this that really jive with that, because he says, this is quoting from the actual account in the newspaper, says, quote, the Negro began moaning and praying and begging to see his mother, but a deaf ear was turned to his entreaties. And then going down to the beginning of the next paragraph, the body remained undisturbed for nearly 2 days. Yeah. So when we go back to places like Ferguson, and people say, why was the response what it was? Yeah. And maybe this will help somebody understand, because this is the cultural memory that many black people navigate through life with. Yeah. And we say, we've seen this before. Right. We know what this really is. And it might not really be that. I get that. I understand that just because we see it doesn't mean it's real. Right. It's because we feel it doesn't mean it's appropriate to feel it. But that might help some other people to say, well, I don't see what you see. Why do you see it? Because this is the history.
Right. And not only that, I mean, you're talking about Ferguson, which was, and the fallout of that was based on this, police and different things. Where did modern policing come from?
Yeah.
Our idea of modern policing. Do you know where that came from?
Slave catching.
Exactly.
You didn't know that
run
part?
away.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can just simply find this out really, really easy. Runaway slaves were property, and we've discussed this before. A full-grown slave was essentially the amount of a new car.
Yeah.
And they would just run off. And so what would happen is they would almost deputize a group of men to go and find them, and they would be brought back. Well, and then of course you had the Fugitive Slave Act and things like that, which made that even more popular. People made money off of that. But our idea of modern policing had its origins from slavery.
Yeah.
And I don't think people think about that, know that, or realize that. But when you look from the history over and over and over again, from slavery to those deputized people who would go and capture to look for African-American men specifically, and then you see a pattern of lynching throughout the South that our justice system evaded. I mean, you said even until 2022, the idea of lynching, sure, I could be caught for a state crime. I could be caught for murder. But the idea that if 20 people wanted to get rid of my life up until a year ago, it was not a federal crime. It was just, another standard crime. But the
Local issue.
It was a local issue, something someone shouldn't have to deal with. But the idea is that, no, there's been a lot of history that builds up to Kamarr's point, is that when people see these things on television, they become incendiary, because we've said this before, African Americans, they have a good memory.
Yeah.
When things are triggering moments, it links back to moments like Mr. Brame. It goes back to slavery. A lot of times it goes back to 1919 and Red Summer. It goes through Jim Crow. It goes through a lot of different episodes throughout history that says, whoa, things in our life have not been good. And when those triggering moments happen, it reminds us that even though things have changed, have they really?
You mentioned last episode more, and I told my wife after recording, I'm like, it was funny because Brandon mentioned this word, not me. But you talk about systems and systems that exist.
Right.
And so getting to this idea of the beginnings of modern policing and all that in America, I was thinking about what you said about systems and how it's actually mentioned in this chapter, and just a gospel idea about this. Okay, so as pastors, as Christians, we believe that our lives were originally built on a bad foundation. But Christ comes and saves and gives us a new foundation. He is that cornerstone. He is the foundation. This is that newness of life. And I think that part of the problem is that some of the conversation we have around these things in America is all about, well, the foundation's good.
Yeah.
The problem is the building. While there are other people who are saying, no, I think the foundation's actually the problem.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm hoping will come out of this discussion that we're having, and other people who are engaging in it, is realizing that, it may not be the foundation needs to be completely destroyed, but there are definitely some issues within the foundation that we need to at least recognize and address. If your foundation is cracked, ignoring it's not going to fix it.
That's true.
You can't say, well, if we have a right earthquake come along, it'll realign it. No, we don't want that.
That's not what we're relying on at this point. Well, I think about this, and I just see so many parallels to some of the situations we've seen in recent years where, the response from a lot of people, and I don't think it's just white people or just black people, that are in view here. We're a complex society, and you have, all kinds of different perspectives coming from all different sort of racial standpoints. But a lot of the response conservatively to, say, Ferguson or to Minneapolis is, first off, well, that person was a criminal. But them being a criminal doesn't justify
Exactly.
this.
Yeah.
And
Brame may have grabbed these young white ladies.
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe he did assault them,
Yeah.
but that's for the court to decide.
Yeah.
And to go along with that point, a lot of those instances that you said in those different cities, those were people who had not yet been adjudicated. They had not yet gone to trial or court. They had not yet been convicted of the crimes that they had been stopped for.
Right.
And so when the extra violence that was, put on them, it was done outside of what the law and justice would have prescribed for them.
Right. And that's, I think the problem is when our discussion, you talk about foundation, when our foundation is, well, they're a criminal, so basically whatever we can do whatever we want to them. Well, that's a bad foundation.
Yeah.
But it's also a bad foundation, and this I think is also missed in the broader discussion. It's also a bad foundation to assume that in a fallen world,
That's right.
there's going to be the possibility of goodness without some.
Yeah.
That's true. You know, you guys are familiar with this. There was a time in our country, I don't know when it changed, and maybe you guys will disagree with me and say it hasn't changed, but there was a time in our country when we were innocent until proven guilty.
Disagree. I don't think there ever existed such a time.
Okay. But you're aware with that popular idea.
Kamarr disagrees, Richard. What are we going to do?
Oh, no.
Okay, but let me
what
ask.
a novel idea. Me
Brand,
disagreeing with something.
but you guys have heard of that.
Yes.
You know, and I don't know.
Those words exist.
And you may have never agreed with that, but did you believe that about our country, Brandon?
Yes.
I did too.
Yes.
I did too. But Kamarr does not.
Remember, okay, full disclosure, remember, my dad was a Black Panther. So I was raised with a different set of teaching of history growing up.
All power to the people.
Yes, but
To all people.
But I was always taught from the beginning of seeing that, you know what, honestly, in this country, if you have enough money, you're innocent until proven guilty. And or if you are the right color, you are innocent until proven guilty. And or if you come from the right place. And so let's say not make it a black issue. If you are a poor white Southerner from Appalachia, you are almost never innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
Okay, so it's not just a black issue or even just a Western, like that was the way I was raised to view it.
Right.
And my life experiences have shown to me that was a proper teaching from my parents, that in this country, really, if you have enough money, you come from the right family, if you have the right skin color for the situation, then you are innocent until proven guilty. But short of that, you're guilty until proven innocent.
I wish you could have enjoyed the innocence that Richard and I did. A moment of just childlike
It was great.
faith in the system.
Nah, never
We are
happened.
innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
How long did you believe
I love that you're not disagreeing with me.
How long did you believe it?
I probably believed that till I was around 20, 21 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. Because think about it like this. If Opie went to the drugstore in Mayberry, and let's just say that Opie stole a piece of candy, and nobody's going to believe Opie stole anything, right? Everybody's going to believe good about Opie. It's Mayberry.
All right, so I was 5. I was 5 years old, and this is when it solidified. My parents had always taught me. I was 5 years old. I was going to a private Christian school at the time, and my friend Lewis, I remember his name and everything. His grandmother actually was my kindergarten teacher too. My friend Lewis and I, we needed money to buy snack after school program. His sister went there, and he said, hey, just go. My sister has my money in her backpack. Just go in her backpack. My money's in there. Grab it, and we'll go, and we'll get our snacks.
Yeah.
And so I did what my friend Lewis said. Went and grabbed his money out of his sister's backpack. We bought our snacks, thought nothing of it. Lewis's sister comes along and says, he stole from me. Talking about me. I say, I didn't steal anything. Lewis told me that was his money in his sister's backpack. And so I got it because Lewis said so. Private Christian school back then is what, 80s? So I got a spanking from the principal over this for being a thief. And then I got a spanking from my mom for a week, every day for a week. And my mom believed me. And she said, this isn't because you stole. This is because you failed to realize what you have to do to make it in this world. You will never forget. You are a black boy going to be a black man. They will never believe you're innocent. You need to navigate correctly or you will die. I am doing this because I don't want you to die.
So she spanked you for a failure to navigate the situation correctly.
For not recognizing Lewis is white, his sister is white, you are black. They will never believe that you didn't steal from her, going in her backpack, taking her stuff.
Okay.
You need to understand this, Kamarr.
So Kamarr, you need to lay on the couch for a minute. Tell me about that.
No, I mean, but this is true because I can look at it and say, okay, my mom was excessive, but my mom was not wrong. I wish you were wrong about what it takes to navigate this world, but she wasn't wrong. The way she handled it, excessive. But when I bring into the trauma of the fact of what she went through in integrating her school, you know, when I think about all those things, I can say, okay, I understand where she came from with that. Right. Was that the right way to teach me that lesson? I don't know that it was, but at the same time, I still remember that lesson.
But you remember.
And I never made that mistake again. Right. I mean, and it didn't prevent me from falling in love with and marrying a white lady either. So it's not like I have this impending fear and hatred of white people from it. But rather she drove home the point that says, no, Kamarr, you will never be innocent until proven guilty in this country. Right. You will never be innocent even when you're innocent in this country. Even when it's your friend stands up and says, no, I told him. Because Lewis said, yeah, I told him to do it. It didn't matter because she said I stole from her. That was the end of the story. And when you look at this story, like, this idea of lynching and what is he? He was accused of doing something to some white girl. So you can understand my mom's like, do you not understand?
Right. Yeah.
You could have died from this, Kamarr. Now, granted, it's 1980s in California. I'm not going to get lynched for that. But just go back in time, not even 20 years, and put me in a different state, and I could have died from that.
Well, and I'll tell you what, growing up, I was born in the 70s, right? So a later part of the 70s, but still the 70s.
But you're still old.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So the idea is I was raised in the South, and the advice that my mom gave me was, better watch out hanging around those white girls. They will get you hung.
Yeah.
And I laughed about it, and she laughed about it a little bit. But the idea is that was my mom was born in 1951, right? There was a reality that, if you mess around with those white girls, you could be hung from her history.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea of like growing up. And of course, I'm married to a white lady, a white woman. But the idea is that was not a cool thing to do. Yeah. A matter of fact, it's only been 50 years since that was legal. And the reason why I'm talking about it is because the majority of these lynchings came from the perception that these mostly African-American men had some interest in a female who happened to be white. Yeah. And the perception was, we learned from Miss Ellen. Miss Ellen said that a lot. The fear was these soldiers were going to come from Clarksville. The fear was that these beasts in human form. The fear was that these black men were going to get entangled with these white women, and that was the biggest fear that the culture at that time seemed like it could imagine. Yeah, and so because that was the biggest fear, they had to put a stop to it. Yeah. And the best way to put a stop to it was to put fear in a population that would attempt to do something like that.
Yeah. And to a large degree, and this is still to a degree even with me, with my kids this day, unfortunately, a part of parenting black children is making sure you pass on that healthy fear. And just think about when we want to talk about the effects of sin in the world, this is a reality of something that was, you could say, done to me, that I am indeed doing to my kids, in the sense of saying there is a certain amount of fear that you need to live with if you're going to survive. Because walking in that one time, like I said, I never really believed in it, but the one time I sat there and said, yeah, what's the big deal? I'm going in a backpack. My brother said, one time, that was 35 years ago. I'm not going to forget that one time. Right. Because I didn't have that healthy fear of, wait a minute, actually, Lewis, you go get it yourself, because I'm black and she's white, and that might not look good.
Do you instill that into your kids today?
Not to the same level it was done for me, because I do believe the world is different, right, and it is not quite as restrictive, as it were. But there is a degree of that. There is a part of that I do teach them, like, hey, like with my daughters, for example, recognizing that, my wife is a very emotional being, and she can get loud and angry sometimes. And my wife and I will make sure that our daughters realize if you get as loud and expressive as your mother in public, it might not go so well for you, because an angry black woman is not the same as an angry white woman.
We need to have a whole show just about how to raise multi-ethnic children.
My wife and I were talking. So my wife and I have been talking about what can we do next to podcast.
I'm out on that one.
My wife and I said we might. But my wife did say that we might do that next. Like, she and I might sit down and actually start a podcast with her and I, just talking about what is it to have an interethnic marriage, and what's it like raising kids and just being two different colors in this world like that.
And Brandon, all you need is one, and then your whole family's multi-ethnic.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You're saying there's a low barrier to entry?
There's a low barrier to entry, and it's accessible to everyone.
Yeah. Well, not really, not anymore. I mean, you're married, and I guess you could adopt.
That's what I was saying.
That's what he was saying. He's not advocating me ditching my wife and family, man.
Well, I was.
What kind of Southern Baptist pastor do you think he is?
I told you earlier, I'm bad Baptist.
You are.
Shut Southern your mouth. Baptist, but he's not.
He's a bad Baptist. Shut your mouth.
I want to talk about Kamarr.
Well, we can dig it. Okay.
You don't know Shaft.
That? Moving on.
You don't know about Shaft. I'm sorry. You don't
know.
No,
sure
Shaft.
don't. Oh. Sure don't.
Moving on up. Okay.
Got it.
Well, okay, back to lynching.
Lighter topics.
This one, okay, 146 got me by surprise. So I'm going to read this passage to you, because this is not something that I have heard a lot about. It says, middle of the page there, for example, in Guthrie in early 1904, Lewis Radford, a black man, was jailed on suspicion that he murdered a young, it says retarded, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody, that's just his words, black woman. While the marshal was at dinner, a black crowd assaulted the black jailer, who had initially refused to turn over the keys to Radford's cell. They could not have issued this demand to a white jailer, and certainly not to a white officer. Radford would not leave his cell and was immediately shot 8 times. His body was hanged from a tree near the entrance to the jail. The perpetrator suffered no legal consequences, and the established pattern once again unfolded, including the subsequent report by the Todd County coroner declaring, quote, the victim was killed by person or persons unknown. Right. So you have this pattern of we don't know who did it when we obviously know who did it.
Exactly.
But this is different because you have a black mob lynching a black man.
Yeah. Now, as you read through this, he makes this justification that, it wasn't always white people who lynched black people. Black people would lynch black people too. And personally, I think it waters down the argument just a little bit because that's not the norm.
Well, there were 5 between 1882 and 1930.
Yeah, there were 5.
So the vast majority of lynchings were not black on black lynchings.
Yeah, and 4 of them took place in Western Kentucky.
Yes. But here's why I think
which is weird.
This is why I think it's relevant though, because going back to modern day where we have these things happen that some of us will say are modern day lynchings, and somebody will say, well, but the officers involved were black. So how could it have been what you're saying it was?
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting because it shows there is historical precedence that says just because the mob is black doesn't mean it's not lynching.
Right.
Yeah,
lynching is lynching regardless who does it.
As pastors, we would say, again, the foundation is bad because it's sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sin is the problem.
Yeah,
and that sin can come out in racially motivated power struggle, or it can come out in non-racially motivated power struggle.
Yeah.
But it's all a rejection of the gospel. It's all an ignorance of the fact that I'm a sinner, you're a sinner. We are in desperate need of grace right now.
Yeah.
Exactly. White skin does not mean sinfulness.
Yeah.
Black skin does not equal sinfulness.
Right.
It's the heart.
Yeah.
Yes.
Human skin equals sinfulness.
Yes.
Like I'm a sinner, you're a sinner. Wouldn't you like to be a sinner too?
No.
I would like to not be a sinner.
I'd like to not be. I'm with Kamarr on this one.
He agreed with me.
Kamarr and I agree on something for a difference.
Yeah. But I do think that is an interesting and relevant thing because so often people are quick to say, well, it can't be that because the color of the skin. It's like, no, lynching is lynching. I mean,
it's
like I said, power
extra
struggle.
legal. It's extra legal violence that is in view here. And, we're told in Romans that the governor's been handed the power of the sword.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. And I see that. I know that. I think the problem comes in anytime, whatever the color of your skin, whatever the motivation you think you're bringing to the table, the moment you take the violence to the problem, you are the problem.
So I'm going to just really quickly tell you why I think lynching was a good thing.
Yes.
Do you remember the Aaron Pettis Bridge incident in Selma?
Edmund.
You're thinking of Aaron.
I'm thinking of
Aaron
Pettis,
our
Edmund Pettis.
fellow pastor.
That's like Aaron Pettis, but he has a bridge named after him. I know the bridge you're talking about.
I know,
I think it's Edmund Pettis.
So if you remember Selma, Martin Luther King, all this kind of stuff. The dogs were released. There was this massive scene that happened on television. Because of that violence, people woke up in America to the idea that things are not good for African Americans in the South. Well, when lynching took place, especially throughout the year 1919, it opened people's eyes that there were atrocities in our own backyard. There were atrocities that it was unspeakable. And if those things had not have happened, I think that people would still be close to the idea of things are that bad. Now, granted, it took another close to 40-something years before the civil rights to change things. Yeah. But that was definitely a motivator for specifically groups like the NAACP because they saw the enrollment of those interested in having an advocate on their side go through the roof. Yeah. And that meant a greater position to speak to politicians, a greater opportunity to speak across the country, and even around the world to get the world's eyes on what was going. Because, to be honest, nobody really knew how bad it was until word started to get out about it.
Mm-hmm. I don't disagree with that part. I think, okay, you're right. It helped get people's attention on it. But I think what we've seen, especially most recently too, again, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that the downside of that being the inciting point of change is that then people think if we just deal with that one thing, the problem is gone. Yeah. And so once lynching was no longer in the news a bunch anymore, I think that's why it took till the 60s, because they're like, well, lynching stopped. You should be happy now. Or even now, it's like, well, I'm not seeing in the news every day that police are detaining and killing a black person. So that means it's all been solved, right? And I think that when we're responding only to these moments like that, it's It's like in medicine. If I have a patient who keeps coming to me and they keep having medical crisis after medical crisis, and I resolve it, I give them that medication, that's that, I didn't solve the problem. There's something going on in this person's body that's not being understood, that's causing chronic disease. And the chronic disease of essentially this sin at the heart of America, of racism. I mean, there's a racism sin.
It still
that's
hasn't
at the
been
foundation.
solved.
It's not been. And as long as we're having these extreme things motivating us, again, like what's happened recently just last weekend, right? If these extreme things are the only thing motivating us, we will never solve the problem. We need to be motivated by something deeper.
And misdiagnosing the problem.
Yeah.
That's right.
The problem is the police. No, the problem is not the police.
No, it's
they
the
have
heart.
legal authority to enforce laws. They have the legal right to do this.
Yeah.
But an individual police officer may exceed
That's
that, and it might become that extra legal violence.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not saying the police are the problem. It's also not saying that, that the criminals aren't criminals.
Yeah.
To say you shouldn't be going here with this.
Yeah.
Again, as pastors, we say the problem is not the color of your skin. The problem is not, the law or the lack of law, or the problem's sin.
Yeah.
It is sin. And the hard work is not only the gospel, it's discipleship.
Yeah.
It's the idea that, yes, somebody has to go and share the good news. Somebody has to go to the racist heart of the most racist person, to the darkest heart of the darkest person, and proclaim a gospel of truth, a gospel of forgiveness, a gospel of love, a gospel that God can take the heart that's made of stone and change it into a heart of flesh, or give a new heart that's made of flesh. And then we have to disciple those folks. Because even if we march down to the center of wherever that KKK chapter is in Dawson Springs, and we proclaim the gospel to every Klan member, they still have a mind that needs to be transformed. They still have neural pathways that think some kind of a way that leads them to think racist thoughts. They still have to be discipled. And I think that's the job of every Christian. I think that's why this is important, that every person who's listening to this, not just pastors, we have an active role in helping our community by simply not only sharing the gospel, but making disciples.
Yes.
And if we were to do that, if we were to take Jesus at his word, when he in Matthew 28:19, and actually go therefore and make disciples, which is a process that's not always easy. It's kind of like, cleaning and gutting fish. It's nasty. It's smelly. You're going to get into some stuff that you may not necessarily be familiar with, but it doesn't mean that we still don't have that Jesus-given mandate to help make followers of him. And that's what we're called to do.
Amen.
One last question before we close this episode out. Back to you, Brandon, on this one, because one, I feel like we do a lot more talking sometimes, Richard and I. But I know
intentional.
I know that since you and I first started down a journey of this sort of discovery, like when you were reading Invisible Man, and you're like, this is amazing, and you've talked about how this is going to affect what you do with your kids, even. Because realizing, so I'm just curious. Ooh. So how has this journey affected the stuff that you talk about in your home with your family?
Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I am learning, I want to pass on to my kids. Mm-hmm. My dad used to tell me, he said, I don't want you to just use your head. Yeah. I want you to use every brain that you can borrow. Yeah. I want you to learn from my experience. I don't want you to have to make all the same mistakes, that kind of stuff. And that kind of got built into, this is what a good parent does. Yeah. When I learned something that it would have been great for me to have learned 30 years ago, I want to make sure my kids learn it now so that they can then learn something 30 years from now they wish they would have learned when they were 8. Yeah. But we're seeing the tide rising, you know, so to speak. And so it's just changed. Like when we go to the library, something as simple as going to the library, I'm intentionally selecting books that might be coming from a different perspective, right? Like here's a celebration of Black culture. And somebody says, well, you're not Black. No, I'm not. And my kids aren't either. That's not going to change. Yeah. But I want them to understand more than I did of what it's like to be Black. Wow. I want them to hear from that perspective so that later when they're confronting the challenges of whatever their day is going to be, because I don't know. Yeah. I can't get concerned with teaching my kids everything, every point, this is what you think. Yeah. What I desperately want to do is teach them how to think. Yeah. And so exposing them to broader viewpoints maybe than I was exposed to, introducing these kind of conversations, pushing back at the very simplistic answers that their culture is often giving them.
Yeah.
I think those are some of the key ways for me where it's like, yeah, you're not black, you're not going to be black, but you need to understand more than you do now what it is like to be black.
Yeah.
Hear from that perspective, value other voices, celebrate diversity. And man, that term has become so used, it's been watered down.
Yeah.
You know, I think about Richard all the time. You saying, what would be great is if we had some more diversity, because then we could be more diverse and then we could celebrate diversity. It's like, it's this catchphrase, but it's like, as Christ followers, man, that's what we got.
Yeah.
Like, that's where we're going,
Yeah.
is this incredible unity that's been built out of this diversity. It's not homogeneity.
Yeah.
Sunday we were talking about husbands and wives, but I was talking about, nobody wants to eat their meal in a blender.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to just get that steak, get that mashed potatoes, get the rolls and just throw it in a blender and let me drink it out of a straw. No, we like the differences.
Yeah.
And what it is together is better than what it could be separately.
That's right.
Yeah.
So extended rant in answer to your question, I guess, but this wanting to help us all understand all the different perspectives and how those things point us to the goodness of God.
No, and I appreciate you doing that. And I wanted to ask that just because I don't know if you knew, Richard, that he was, but like I can see that where like whole reason I'm like, man, I didn't know this. All right, I got. You talk about like that with your kids? I don't do that. And I hadn't actually gotten any input from you what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
But I think it is a good thing because there are people, I know some people like who listening and we get feedback from them.
Yeah.
And I know they're enjoying seeing this conversation, hearing this conversation. But there might be others who are listening like, all right, I get it. I'm not black.
Yeah.
What do I do
with this?
What do I do with this?
Yeah.
And you gave a great example because for me, what I do with my kids is different. What Richard does with his kids is different.
Yeah.
What you do with your kids, everybody's going to be different. But some people are going to sit there and say, how do I begin this conversation? And that's a great way, like you said, just go to the library and just start being intentional on what books you pick up.
Yeah.
And saying, hey, guys. And something else I will say that I know you do that you didn't say here that people need to understand is that you're a critical person in the sense that you don't just read something and say, whatever it says, that must be true.
Right.
And you've taught that to your kids as well.
That's
so picking it up and saying, we're going to read this and learn about their experience does not mean we're going to then also mimic it and mirror it and believe everything they say.
Right.
But rather, we're going to read it and we're going to critique it and say, okay, what is the good? What is the bad? What can we take from it? But we're still going to read it all the same. And so I just want to add in there because people might come back like, so Brandon, you're going woke now? Well, that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day. But realize that when he's saying take it up and sharing it, that doesn't mean just receive whatever it is
Absolutely.
but be open to hearing from them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun rising.
Right.
Not that I can see it, but by it I can see everything else.
Yeah.
And so I don't bring, race issues as the lens with which I view everything.
Yeah.
Christ is the lens on my good days. Christ is the lens through which I view everything. Not my tradition, not my background, not my experience, not your background, your experience, or your tradition.
Yeah.
Christ. But in viewing everything through the lens of Christ, I'm going to come to the point where I can celebrate that diversity rather than be afraid of it. Or fear that I'm going woke. Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to end this episode there. I know we talked about more than just lynching. I'm sorry, Richard. I know you just want to talk about lynching for 5 hours. No.
We could do that.
But
Next time.
I haven't said this before, but thank you to everybody who is out there listening and watching and putting up with us.
Share it
and
with a friend.
Let's take a potty break.
That sounds like a great.
Not together.
No, not together.
Separately.
No, we're not that way.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution, organization, or corporation. The material and information presented here are for general information purposes only. All persons who participated did so of their own free will and speak for themselves only, regardless of any personal affiliations they may possess. Been Pastoring Through Some Hard Times is a production of Salt.Light.Love Ministries, all rights reserved.
Amen.